It started with a stranger no one remembered the name of. A traveler passing through the edge of Lantern Hollow who stopped at the dry goods store and wrinkled his nose. He said something foul lingered downwind like spoiled meat or a buried thing fighting to surface. No one responded, no one wanted to. But word reached the sheriff anyway, as it always did in a town like this. Sheriff Boone saddled up before dusk and rode west through the cottonwoods where the breeze thickened with summer rot. He didn't need to ask directions. Everyone knew the wind carried strange things near the Garvey property. He'd known that for years. The Garvey barn stood wide and tired, its roof sagging as if bowed by the weight of secrets too long kept. The air grew heavier near the fence line. Flies hovered in swarms so dense they moved like smoke. Sheriff Boone dismounted slowly, boot heels crunching dry weeds, his hand brushing the barn door only once before stopping. He didn't knock. No one answered anyway. The hayloft door above creaked open and something thumped inside, heavy, wet. Then silence. The kind of silence that waits to be broken by something worse. He entered. Inside, the barn was hotter than it had any right to be. The hay smelled sweet, but beneath it, something else. Something layered and wrong, like blood washed in milk and left to ferment. He walked slow. Past the wooden stalls, past empty feed buckets, past a hanging chain that swayed without wind. In the far corner, hay was piled too neatly, a kind of square mound freshly stacked. Boone knelt beside it. The scent was stronger there, undeniable now. Underneath the surface of that sweet golden straw was something dead, or not quite dead enough. He reached for the pitchfork resting nearby, used it to pull the hay back, a layer, then another. Damp straw clung to the metal tines like wet paper. He paused, then pushed deeper. A dark smear soaked through the bottom layers, too thick to be runoff, too still to be animal. Boone's jaw tightened. He pulled back, stood up, and looked around. The barn was silent again, the hay still, the air pressing. He turned and left without disturbing it further. On the porch of the Garvey house sat Clara Garvey, her hands folded in her lap, apron clean, eyes soft like someone who'd never buried anything worse than a garden bulb. She greeted him like a neighbor. Said the calf died early in the spring. Said they burned the remains by the stream weeks ago. Boone nodded. He didn't ask about the hay. He didn't ask about the noise overhead or the barrel near the well that hadn't been moved in years. He asked if she'd seen any travelers. She smiled, said not in months. He tipped his hat and walked back to his horse. That night, Boone returned to town and said nothing. He filed no report, told no deputy, made no mention of the flies or the heat or the stench that soaked into his clothes and wouldn't come out no matter how many times he scrubbed his hands. He told himself there was nothing there, that what he smelled was old livestock or spilt milk or something natural enough not to chase. But something in his eyes dimmed after that visit. He stopped sitting near the church window, stopped walking past the nursery in town, and when another traveler came through weeks later and asked what that smell was on the west wind, Boone didn't answer at all. The Garvey barn remained closed for the rest of the summer, but the scent never fully left. It rose again with every storm, every shift in wind, every blistered dusk when the air clung too close to the skin, and the town, like Boone, learned to live with it, learned to pretend it was part of the land, like dust or mold or memory. Something better left undisturbed. Miss Harrow arrived with a suitcase, a red scarf, and a habit of asking questions most in Lantern Hollow had trained themselves not to ask. She kept neat records, tallied names in a blue cloth ledger, each in fine ink. It wasn't until she'd filled the first 2 pages that the pattern began to whisper back. There were too many babies born near the Garvey property, yet few ever made it past their 2nd year. fewer still to school age. She noticed because she taught in a single-room classroom where empty desks didn't just mean absence, they meant erasure. She asked the county for birth counts. They matched. She checked cemetery stones. They didn't. The numbers were off. The dead weren't buried, at least not anywhere official. They had vanished without a line written, as if their small lives had been erased before language could record them. She walked each morning past the Garvey farm to reach the schoolhouse, and the windows always seemed too clean, too still, like glass waiting for something to break. Clara Garvey often waved, always holding a tin pail, always smiling. Harrow began noticing the sound of infants crying, not from the homes nearby, but from somewhere far behind the barn, always just as she passed, always stopping when she turned her head. At first, she told herself it was wind or her imagination or old wood moaning in the summer heat. But the sound kept returning, and the missing names kept growing. She started asking the children in class where their younger siblings had gone. Some shrugged, others looked to the floor. One girl said her baby brother went to sleep in the Garvey barn one afternoon and was never spoken of again. That night, Miss Harrow opened her ledger again and drew a tiny circle beside each child's name whose sibling had gone missing. By morning, the page looked diseased, a rash of empty dots swallowing half the town's future. She wrote a letter to the county clerk requesting old medical records. 3 weeks later, a sealed packet arrived. In it, she found what appeared to be legitimate birth entries, but nearly all the death causes were blank or labeled pending. One file bore the note, removed, no remains recovered, presumed stillborn. It had been signed by the town's own Sheriff Boone in ink as neat as her own. That child had been born healthy 2 months earlier, according to a midwife's testimony buried on the reverse side of the page. Miss Harrow pressed the pages flat, staring long enough that her eyes burned. Then she closed the packet and slid it under her floorboard. The next morning, the window to the schoolhouse had been cracked open. Nothing was stolen, but her desk drawers had been rearranged. She did not report it. She simply stopped wearing the red scarf and began walking to school faster, her eyes always forward, never on the Garvey house, even when the pail dropped and the smile stayed. The boy's name was Nathaniel Pike, age 11, son of the local blacksmith. He was the kind that wandered. Scuffed shoes, dirt under his nails, always one question too many for the quiet kind of town that didn't welcome curiosity. It was late September when he made the mistake. A dare whispered by another child, but it didn't take much to push Nathaniel. They said no one had ever stayed in the Garvey barn longer than a breath. He promised to stay 5 whole minutes. That afternoon, while Clara Garvey attended to something behind the house, Nathaniel slipped through the side gate and entered the barn alone. Inside, the air was still and sour. Dust hung like sleep in the air. Nathaniel walked slow, one hand on the rough wall for balance, the other brushing hay that crunched beneath his boots. The silence grew louder the deeper he went. Then he saw it, the bench. It wasn't where a bench ought to be. It sat in the far corner of the barn, too low to sit, too wide to ignore. It looked built for something not quite human. The wood was dark and worn, the surface curved in a way that cradled rather than supported. And there, along the inner curve, was the stain. It wasn't milk. Nathaniel stared at the bench too long. His breathing slowed. He stepped closer and noticed small straps nailed into the wood. 4 of them spaced evenly apart. 2 were frayed as if torn free. The center of the bench bore a circular groove carved deep and smooth, like it had been worn down by time or by something softer than hands. Beneath it, a metal bowl sat, crusted with something brown-black. It smelled sweet and wrong. Flies moved in spirals over it like dancers. He didn't scream, he didn't touch anything. But something about the bench pulled him like it was made to hold not a child, but the part of one no one else sees. Something in him cracked. He backed away without turning around, his eyes fixed on that groove. He left the barn the way he came, but he never spoke of what he saw. That night he didn't eat. By morning his mother said he was fevered. By the next week, he stopped going to school, then he stopped speaking altogether. Miss Harrow noted his absence. She visited the blacksmith's home once, saw Nathaniel sitting on the floor staring at nothing. He flinched when she said his name. A month later, he was sent to live with distant cousins near St. Louis. No one in Lanton Hollow ever saw him again. The Garvey barn remained closed. The bench remained exactly where it was. And no one ever asked who had built it or what it had fed. Miss Harrow didn't plan to go to the Garvey barn. She told herself her questions were innocent, her concerns proper. But Nathaniel's silence lingered. She'd seen many kinds of grief in children, but what filled his eyes was something else. Not loss, but recognition of something too large to name. When no one answered her letters, when the town grew stiff and soft-spoken at the mention of his name, she folded her lesson plans one afternoon and walked west, not bothering to ask permission. She knew where the path turned sharp and the trees leaned wrong. The closer she came to the Garvey property, the more the air seemed to thin, like the sky itself refused to breathe there. She passed the porch without knocking. No one came out, no voices called. The barn door stood half-latched, the light inside gray and still. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world behind her narrowed. The air folded shut. Her shoes sank slightly in the packed dirt floor. The smell wasn't strong, but it carried weight. Something metallic under sweet rot, like old blood rinsed from a silver spoon. She moved carefully, each step matched by silence. Her eyes adjusted slowly. There were jars along the far shelf, their contents clouded and still. Some held liquid the color of cream left too long in sun. Others had things inside, soft shapes floating unbothered by time. She didn't approach them. She looked to the corner instead, where the bench sat waiting, exactly as Nathaniel must have seen it. But there was more. Behind the bench, half hidden by hanging burlap, was another space. Narrow, too narrow for anything but crawling. Yet tracks led in, marks in the dirt, low to the ground, spaced like knees dragging behind a reaching hand. She dropped to the floor without knowing why and peered inside. What she saw did not make sense. At first she thought it was a nest. Tangled cloth, pieces of rusted tools, feathers, string. But there were bones too, infant-sized, arranged in circles. Each skull painted with something dark, a line across the forehead, a mark beneath the chin. In the center of the circle was a doll made from twine and teeth, its chest hollowed and stuffed with dried petals. She did not scream. She simply crawled backward, stood, and left the barn without closing the door. Her hands shook. Her heart did not race. She walked the road back to town without a word, without breath, without focus. That night, she forgot how to sign her name. The next morning, she couldn't remember what her mother's voice sounded like. She did not return to the classroom. For 1 week, she sat in her boarding room staring at her own shoes as if they didn't belong to her. When she finally spoke again, she asked what month it was. No one had the courage to ask what she saw. And she never walked west again. Her name was Ida Clemens, and she had not spoken about the Garvey place in 17 years. Not since her mother worked there as a housemaid during the last year of her life. Not since she was 8 years old, small enough to be carried, quiet enough to be forgotten. She returned to Lanton Hollow after decades away, not to settle but to sell the last piece of land her uncle left behind, a border parcel that touched the Garvey fence at the edge of the pasture. When she passed the barn, her legs stopped moving on their own. The boards looked the same. So did the shade under the awning. Something buried inside her memory pressed forward, slow and painful, like something pushed beneath skin trying to surface through old bone. She did not cry, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she told the pharmacist what she remembered. And what she remembered made no sense at all. She remembered wooden crates, not for apples or eggs, but for infants. 6 of them all lined against a far wall in the Garvey basement, a part of the house no one talked about, a root cellar that had no roots. She had seen them only once, carried there by her mother late one night when a storm cracked the sky and Clara Garvey called every servant to help. Ida had been half asleep, eyes barely open, head resting on her mother's shoulder when they descended the steps. But when they reached the bottom, she was fully awake. The crates weren't ordinary, they were narrow, custom-built, reinforced with iron bolts. Each had a slatted lid like a cage turned face down, fastened shut with metal latches. Inside each one something moved. At first she thought they were animals. Piglets maybe, but the sounds they made weren't squeals. They were breaths, wet, rattling breaths. Then one let out a noise Ida would never forget. A cry that wasn't shaped right, the kind of cry that broke too early, as if the throat had learned to scream before it learned to swallow. Her mother whispered not to look, but Ida did. Through the slats she saw a face, not full, just a portion. An eye too wide, a nose pressed flat from inside, and something sewn along the forehead. Not stitched, branded. It looked like a number, or a letter. She couldn't read then, but she never forgot the shape. A loop with a line through it, burned in. One of the crates rocked slightly, and Clara hissed something sharp to another maid. They were feeding them, Ida realized. Bottles warmed in a pot. Each child fed on cue, not when it cried, but when instructed. The bottles were labeled, not with names, but with dates and symbols. One showed a spiral. One showed a set of teeth. Another had no label at all. Ida's mother carried her out soon after, and they never went back. Her mother left the job within the week. 2 months later, she was dead. Fever, they said. Quick and silent, no burial, no priest. Now, decades later, Ida whispered the memory aloud in the back of the pharmacy, and the clerk just nodded once. Didn't write anything down. Didn't ask for more. Just rang up her medicine and handed her the bag. On the way out, Ida glanced toward the west pasture where the barn roof still leaned. She didn't go closer. She didn't need to. The memory was too clear. She didn't imagine it. She couldn't have. The way the light hit the crates, the sound of that broken cry, and the faint hum, soft and steady, that came from beneath the floorboards the entire time they were down there, like something mechanical or something alive, something waiting. The storm came heavy, sudden, and mean. Wind peeled at the barn roof and rain struck like fists on tin. By dawn, half the Garvey pasture was mud, and the barn's east wall sagged inward, warped from years of quiet rot. No one in town offered to help repair it. They didn't even speak of it. But a week later, when a drifter named Ellis stopped to take shelter inside, he found something the town had buried in silence. The floorboards along the northern beam had lifted from water damage, curling upward like fingers pulling back a veil. Beneath them was not soil. It was metal, rusted but sharp-edged, a hatch sealed tight with bolts that hadn't seen light in decades. Ellis opened it with the butt of a rock. Inside wasn't storage. It wasn't for grain or tools. It was a narrow compartment lined in rubber and lined again in mirrors. Dull, pitted glass screwed into the frame so a person lying inside would see themselves from every angle. On the far end of the compartment were instruments arranged like a ritual. Small mechanical arms, levers, and clamps. Some looked surgical, Others didn't belong to any known trade. One was a long rod with threading like a screw but tipped with bone. Another was a glass tube filled with something yellow and slow-moving with a needle on one end and a hollow spoon on the other. There were no labels, only carvings. Symbols etched into each piece, none repeated, none familiar. Spirals, forked crosses, a single eye dripping from a crown. Not religious, not medical. Something older, something made to mark, to drain, to shape. He didn't stay long. He sealed it back, replaced the boards, and left town by nightfall, leaving behind only a journal entry and a boarding house ledger. It read, "Found tools under floor. Not for farming, not for fixing. They were for something else, something alive." The entry was crossed out by the next morning as if someone had returned and removed it with care. The housekeeper who'd read it once before it was erased said she never forgot the word alive. By mid-autumn, that section of the barn collapsed completely. Clara Garvey told the sheriff the storm had done it. When he came to check, the hatch was gone. The floor sealed again with new boards, fresh nails, same old dust. Boone didn't ask questions. He just tipped his hat and left, the way he always did. But he never stood close to that part of the barn again. Something in his posture changed. He looked to the trees more than the door, as if waiting for someone else to come or something. Because what they found under the floor wasn't meant to be used once. It had been cleaned, arranged, prepared for use again. And what disturbed Boone most wasn't what those tools did. It was that someone built them by hand. Slowly, lovingly, with patience only madness could explain. Long after the barn was patched and the floor resealed, the quiet around the Garvey farm deepened into something heavier than silence. It was the kind that made people walk a little faster past the West Road, the kind that made church hymns drop a note when Clara Garvey entered the room. But it wasn't until a clerk named Lyle Denforth began cleaning the county records that the rot spread into paper. He was a small man with a limp and no family, tasked with filing and organizing nearly a decade's worth of unindexed permits, death logs, and civic approvals stacked in iron drawers at the back of the sheriff's office. He wasn't paid to ask questions, only to alphabetize. But what he found stopped him cold. A leather-bound ledger, heavier than it looked, sat buried under tax records. Its spine cracked like skin when opened. Inside were pages dated between 1903 and 1910. Each entry listed a removal, handwritten, neat, and clinical. The word removal was not explained. No child's name, no family reference, just a date, a parcel number, a reason left blank or marked private, and a signature. Over 100 such entries filled the book. Most happened within a few miles of the Garvey property. Nearly all involved infants under 2 years old. None listed a return. At the bottom of each page was the same signature, Sheriff Alton Boone. The name wasn't forged. It was written in the same slanted cursive Boone used when signing marriage licenses and livestock registrations. But something about the way it sat on the page felt different. It was careful, too careful, like someone trying to appear normal while holding their breath. Lyle flipped through every page twice. Nowhere did it say where the children had gone, only that they had been removed with consent. But no mother ever signed, no father, just Boone. And sometimes in the far column, a symbol instead of a check mark. A spiral, a broken cross, a teardrop with a line through it. Lyle brought the ledger to the deputy the next morning. By noon it was gone. Sheriff Boone claimed it never existed. He said Lyle was tired, overworked. He offered him a short leave and a raise. Lyle left town a week later and was never seen again. No forwarding address, no resignation filed. His room above the bakery remained untouched for months, still holding his coat. his boots, and a folded note tucked into a hymnal. The note had no words, just a drawn symbol, a loop with a line through it. The removals stopped appearing in town records after 1910. But no one believed they stopped happening. The children still disappeared, only now without paper. And Boone's name began showing up elsewhere, on approvals for private land access, on permits for excavation, on sealed coroner notes marked with the word insufficient. By the time Miss Harrow asked for the ledger herself, she was told it had been destroyed in a fire. But the sheriff's office never caught fire. No one could recall any flames. Just a foul-smelling smoke that drifted through the hall one morning, strong enough to clear the clerks for a day. When they returned, 2 drawers had been emptied. The only record left was a single torn page, half charred, bearing the faint outline of a boot print and Boone's signature beneath the words, "For the good of the community." Behind closed doors, it became clear what those removals had meant. They weren't deaths. They weren't adoptions. They were transactions, sanctioned, scheduled, protected by law. And Sheriff Boone, whatever his reason, had not just allowed them. He had signed his name to every single one, in ink. Without hesitation, and the ink, when held up to light, shimmered slightly, as if something else had seeped through the paper. Something not meant to be read, only followed. Her name was Lydia May Fielding, 17 years old, bone-thin with skin that looked dusted in ash even when clean. She had no family name on record past infancy, no official birth certificate, no known place of origin. The record said she was taken in by the Fieldings in 1902 as an orphaned barn infant. That's what the midwife called her when she was brought to the farmhouse doorstep, a term whispered in hushed tones when no one else was listening. Lydia didn't speak until age 6. She didn't cry when hurt, didn't blink when scolded. But every Sunday near dusk, without fail, she would fall to her knees and scream, a raw, high sound that never changed in pitch, never lessened, never rose. It would last for 6 minutes exactly, then stop. Every Sunday, until she turned 15. Then she stopped screaming altogether and refused to say why. When she was 17, a nurse named Edie Talmont coaxed a story out of her during a hospital stay for an infected burn. Lydia spoke in flat tones, her voice more memory than thought. She said that before she was given a name, she was kept in a long wooden room with other babies, though she never saw their faces, only their hands through slats. She remembered the ceiling. It had symbols carved into the beams. Spirals, crosses, upside-down letters. She remembered a sound like a cow's cry, but thinner, like something pretending to be an animal. It always came right before the bottle. The bottle was brown glass with a black rubber top, filled with thick milk that smelled burnt. It had a paper tag that read calf feed, the same tag every time. It came from gloved hands that didn't tremble, passed through a slot, always at sunset on Sundays. The milk made her sleepy, but never full. And after it, she said her body would shake without cold. Her skin would sting behind her ears. She described pressure on her chest that made her lungs feel folded. One time she passed out. When she woke up, her mouth was filled with gauze. She doesn't know what was taken. What Lydia remembered most was the light. There was a square cut in the top of the crate, just big enough to let light in. But the light didn't come from outside. It came from a lamp mounted on the ceiling, always warm, always humming, never flickering. It wasn't sunlight. She said the light had a color she didn't know how to name. Not yellow, not white. A color that made the crying stop for a second. Not because it comforted, but because it watched. When the nurse asked if she knew where this happened, Lydia simply said, "The barn." When asked how she got out, she said she didn't. She just woke up outside one morning, teeth aching, feet bare. There was no note, no trail, only the bottle still clutched in her small hand. The Fieldings found her that way, curled near their fence line, silent, too clean to have walked through the pasture, too quiet to have wandered. The bottle was gone by the time they took her in. But every Sunday at dusk she screamed again, not out of pain, but remembrance, and only years later did the scream begin to feel familiar. It wasn't hers alone. She said it sounded like the calves the Garveys slaughtered for meat, but too high, too hollow, too human. And every time it echoed, she said she felt the milk return to her throat. Warm, sour, and laced with something she now believed was never meant for calves at all. Jacob Rensley had been an undertaker's son long enough to know the smell of time. He was 15 when he first helped clean a body and 26 when he returned to Lantern Hollow after his father's stroke. By then, he thought he'd seen everything flesh could do once it stopped being flesh. He was wrong. The Garvey shed hadn't been opened in years, tucked behind the barn in a corner of land even animals avoided. When it rained, water pooled around its stone base but never seeped in. A strange blessing, some said. Others believed it was because the shed had a poured concrete floor, poured when no one else in town even had plumbing. Jacob found it while clearing brush, ordered by the council to prepare the area for fencing. The door didn't creak. It gave way like it had been waiting for someone with the right kind of silence in their bones. Inside, the room was almost empty. One wooden table, 2 shelves with sealed tins of lard, and a single barrel pressed against the far wall, its top held down by 5 rusted iron clamps. Not nails, not rope, clamps, the kind made for ceiling pressure, not weight. The metal groaned as Jacob pried them loose. The lid cracked, and the smell that hit him was not rot. It was iron, sharp, rich, alive. He stared down at the liquid, thick and red as if it had been spilled minutes ago. But the barrel bore the date 1900 scorched into its side. He dipped a stick into the liquid, half expecting it to burn. It didn't, but it clung, viscous and bright, coating the wood in a way that shimmered when held to light. Then he saw what floated beneath the surface. Not a body, not an organ, but something suspended. A bundle of what looked like small limbs, partial but unmistakable. Fingers too thin to be full term, one still curled into a point. At first he thought it was a malformed calf or some preserved medical specimen. But there were markings on the flesh, not natural, not accidental. Each limb bore a single symbol cut into the skin, the same ones that had shown up on the instruments under the barn. He recognized one from the story Lydia May told the nurse, the loop with a line through it. He didn't scream. He didn't cover the barrel. He simply closed the shed and went home. But the next day he returned with a cloth, gloves, and a jar. Not to clean, not to report, but to take a sample. He said it was for evidence. But something else had begun to stir in him. A thought he couldn't name. An itch behind the eyes. He kept the jar sealed, hidden in his father's old embalming cabinet. And every night he checked it. The liquid never darkened, never clouded. It stayed red, stayed perfect. No mold, no decay. Like it had been made to last. By the end of the month, Jacob stopped coming into town. His father died, and the body was buried without formal rites. No one saw who dressed him. The coffin was nailed shut early. When a neighbor checked on Jacob weeks later, he found the house clean, the windows covered, and a strange humming coming from the basement. The embalming cabinet was locked. The jar was gone. Back at the Garvey shed, the barrel had been resealed. New clamps, new wax, fresh straw packed around its base. As if someone wanted it to stay hidden, or worse, wanted it to wait, because whatever floated in that liquid wasn't just preserved, it had been suspended for a reason. Studied maybe, or saved, and the blood, if it was blood, had defied every law Jacob knew. It hadn't dried, it hadn't turned, it hadn't obeyed death. And in Lantern Hollow, where even time seemed to avoid certain truths, that kind of disobedience wasn't just unnatural. It was chosen. Miss Harrow had not spoken of the Garvey barn in years, not since the afternoon she forgot her own name and stopped walking past the West Road altogether. But something in her never settled, not in her body, not in her sleep. The memory stayed where it always had, beneath the ribs pulsing like a second heart. She returned to teaching briefly, but never let the door shut all the way. Never taught past dusk. Never let children near the map pinned on the wall where the Garvey land had once been marked in red ink. By the spring of 1912, she requested a transfer and was granted one without question. They said she moved east, quiet town, smaller school, easier hours. But that wasn't where she ended up. She was seen again 2 years later in St. Louis, thinner, dressed in gray, seated at the corner of a tavern across from a man named Harold Danning, a journalist with a reputation for printing stories others wouldn't touch. He'd come to Lantern Hollow once, long before she left, sniffing at rumors, dismissed by the sheriff, shunned by the mayor. But he remembered her name. She was the one with the ledger, the one who asked about the missing infants. Now she was ready to talk. She didn't bring her original notes. Those had been burned, she claimed, by hands not her own. But she remembered enough to redraw everything. Over 2 nights, she gave him diagrams of the barn's inner walls, numbers of how many crates she believed existed beneath the floor, a list of children who vanished from her class in one winter alone. She described symbols carved into the beams, some identical to those found on the sheriff's removal logs. She told him about the infant she'd seen locked in, how it never cried unless the room went quiet, as if silence was the signal for pain. And she told him something worse, that she had heard voices in the barn not belonging to any adult, voices that instructed, voices that laughed. On the 3rd day, they traveled back to Lantern Hollow together. She didn't tell the town she had returned. They went straight to the property. Boone was gone by then, buried 3 counties over after an illness no doctor could diagnose. The Garvey barn was still standing, the house empty, the doors latched. Miss Harrow waited until sundown, then entered with Danning close behind. Neither was seen again. 2 days later, a groundskeeper from the neighboring pasture found a stack of papers nailed to the inside of the schoolhouse door. They were pages from a journal marked Harrow. They weren't in her handwriting. They were neater, almost perfect. The ink was fresh. On them were dozens of notes, recorded times, dates, feeding intervals, diagrams of altered cribs. And a final line scrawled near the bottom of the last page. They trained the quiet ones to feed. No explanation, no signature, just those words. The sheriff's office dismissed the note as a hoax. The school burned a week later. Lightning, they said, but no rain fell that week, and the lightning struck only once, right through the roof, into the desk where Miss Harrow once kept her ledgers. No remains of her or Danning were ever recovered. Only a single glove was found, hers, folded neatly and placed atop the old teacher's desk. Beneath it, a note in her handwriting, older than the rest, faded, nearly unreadable. It said only this: "They don't drink to live, they drink to remember." The 1913 census arrived late that year, carried by a man who never returned for his bag. He dropped it on the county clerk's desk and left without his coat, walking east without a word. Inside the bag were files bound tight with wax string, sorted by township and stamped with the seal of the Missouri State Office. When Lantern Hollow's records were unwrapped, something surfaced no one wanted to see. The birth count was high, unusually so for a town of its size, nearly double that of other towns within a 100-mile radius. Over 9 years, the forms recorded 87 live births, but the adult count had not risen in kind. In fact, it had shrunk. The numbers showed what no one dared say aloud. Children were appearing, but parents were not. There were no matching mothers on the official census for more than half the infants listed. No last names repeated, no family links confirmed. And when the cemetery records were pulled to verify death reports, another absence appeared, one deeper than the first. The town graveyard had plots for veterans, farmers, teachers, and children. Rows of stones, weathered and leaning, marked by lichen and time. But among them, only 3 graves belonged to women of childbearing age. 3, in a town that claimed almost 90 births in less than a decade. And of those 3, none had been buried with a child. The gravedigger, old enough to remember when the Garveys first arrived, confessed in a quiet moment that no stillborns had ever been brought to him. No tiny boxes, no family requests for a short row. And yet he remembered the sound of women weeping, not in homes but in the church basement, quiet, low, wrong. He said they came in pairs, never spoke, never looked up. They arrived after dark and left before sunrise, but he remembered their eyes. Empty, as if something had been taken, not lost. The town doctor, who kept immaculate records, had filed only 10 birth certificates over the same span. But the children existed. They could be counted. Seen. Some were known to teachers, others appeared briefly, then vanished. Moved away, it was always said, but no letters ever came, no forwarding addresses. No one knew where they had gone. When a young archivist from the county tried to map maternal lines for a genealogy project, she found that half the children had no traceable maternal record at all. Many had been taken in by older couples or found on porches during storms. Some had been named by nurses, others by priests, but the names carried no roots. It was as if the children had bloomed from the land itself, soil-fed and sun-starved, planted like crops. One quiet evening, the archivist visited the cemetery herself. She walked the rows and counted again. Then she walked to the edge where the fence met the pasture that once touched Garvey land. There, buried in grass and nearly overtaken by vines, she found a stone with no name. Just a carved spiral and a date, chipped nearly smooth. Around it 4 more stones, shorter, arranged in a perfect square. No flowers, no offerings. Just weeds and a single empty bottle, brown glass, corked and sealed with wax. She took no notes that day. She packed her things and never returned. But in her final report filed months later, she wrote one line that didn't match the rest of her formal tone. It said, "This town has too many children and too few ghosts." And though no one knew exactly what she meant, some felt the truth in their teeth. That whatever had happened in Lantern Hollow had taken the mothers, but not their memories. And the land somehow had swallowed the bodies, but let the hunger remain. When the Garvey house was finally scheduled for demolition in 1932, no one volunteered to swing the first hammer. The land had been purchased by the county 2 years prior, but crews kept refusing the job. Stories had followed the place long after the family line went quiet. Long after the barn collapsed under snow and the shed was overtaken by moss. The house itself had survived every storm. Its roof never leaked, its glass never cracked. But it was the stillness that made men uneasy. The way no birds ever nested in the eaves, no weeds broke the porch boards. The house stayed whole because something in it wanted to remain. They hired a crew from out of town, men who had never heard of the missing ledgers or the children who cried without mothers. On the first day, they removed the shutters and doors. On the second, they pried open every drawer, every cupboard, every sealed panel. Nothing stood out until one worker yanked down the kitchen curtains and felt something hard rattle against his wrist. He thought it was beads. Then he looked closer. Along the hem, small white objects were stitched with black thread, uneven, irregular, and unmistakably human. Teeth. Dozens. Tiny, brittle teeth. They called in the foreman, who ordered every curtain in the house taken down and laid flat. Each one told the same story. The teeth were sewn into the hem in a continuous chain, like trim, looped and tied with care. Most were baby teeth, smooth-edged, dull in color. But some were older. Molars, sharpened, cracked. And on several, if held close to the light, letters had been scratched into the enamel. Not etched deeply, just enough to scar. Some bore initials, others symbols already seen on the floorboards and barrels. One had a date, 1904. The thread that held them in place was dark gray, the kind used for upholstery, and it had held firm all those years. There was no rot in the fabric, no mold on the stitches, as if the air had been preserved just for them. The county halted demolition and brought in a sheriff from 2 towns over. Sheriff Langley lasted one walk through. He left behind his badge and asked to be reassigned. In his final report, he wrote only that the objects found in the house do not align with natural memory. That was the phrase. Not logic, not reason, but memory. As if what they uncovered threatened not just explanation, but the ability to forget. A carpenter tasked with cataloging the findings grew obsessed. He claimed the spacing of the teeth followed a pattern. He laid the curtains flat and measured the gaps. He said it was a code. Every third tooth marked a new sentence. Every initial matched a name in the town's missing birth ledgers. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Then one night he was found on the Garvey porch, teeth pulled from his own mouth, sewn crudely into his collar with fishing wire. The curtains were never recovered. The house was burned a week later. No demolition, no salvage, just fire. Controlled, sanctioned, lit by the county under a cloudy sky. But even as the walls blackened and the roof gave way, no one saw the windows shatter. They melted inward, slow and quiet, as if trying to keep something sealed. The last piece to fall was the kitchen rod, curtain still clinging to it by 2 threads. It vanished in the smoke, teeth glinting once before the cloth turned to ash. No one rebuilt on that land. They fenced it, posted a sign with no name, but the fence never kept out the wind. And sometimes when the sun cut through at the right angle, children swore they saw something flutter. Something light, like fabric, moving at the edge of the field. And if they got close enough, they said it didn't sound like cloth. It sounded like teeth. The minutes were buried deep in the courthouse cellar, kept in a metal drawer marked Administrative Internal Only. No one had opened it in decades. It was a visiting university archivist, young and persistent, who found them while documenting the evolution of municipal land use policies. She wasn't looking for history. She was looking for zoning changes. What she found instead was a sealed envelope from 1907 labeled Confidential Council Directive 43B. Inside were 9 sheets of yellowed paper typed on a machine that stuttered in places. The language was formal, cold, the kind used when people wanted to say something awful without appearing monstrous. The council had passed a motion unanimously, signed and stamped, to limit public record requests regarding juvenile removals, midwife transfers, and agricultural infant burial sites. The stated reason was to prevent reputational harm to the township and preserve external confidence in local governance. The phrase used throughout the minutes was safeguard local trust. The vote had taken place after 3 consecutive council meetings were disrupted by mothers asking about their missing children. One woman was removed by force after placing her still warm birth certificate on the mayor's desk, and demanding to know why the town physician had declared her child formally unrecorded. That same month, an unnamed ordinance was added to the township code. It allowed the sheriff's office to redirect maternal complaints regarding infants to a private welfare channel, a process managed internally by Sheriff Boone and 3 appointed citizens whose names were redacted in the minutes. The channel had no physical office, no funding trail, but it was used over 50 times in 4 years. There was also mention of the Garveys, indirectly. A line noted, family-sponsored agricultural initiatives vital to town economy and regional research interests. Another memo described non-disclosure understandings between private landholders and the council. One entry stated, consent must not be presumed but may be structured in silence. Structured silence is protective silence. Beneath it in handwriting, someone had underlined those words and written, not protective, purchased. These minutes were not part of the public ledger. They had been stored intentionally out of order. The archivist who found them submitted a single-paragraph summary to her advisor, who replied 3 days later urging her to leave them untouched. When she returned to the courthouse to photograph the pages, the drawer had been emptied. A clerk swore no one had accessed the file. The only thing left behind was a single typed line, folded once and pinned under the drawer's handle. The council speaks so the people don't have to. News of the document never made it to press. The archivist resigned from her program within the year and moved out of state. But before she left, she mailed a copy of the minutes to a retired judge who had ruled on several juvenile estate cases in the region. He responded with one sentence in his final interview. They didn't keep it quiet out of fear, they kept it quiet because it worked. Lantern Hollow never repealed the directive. The language faded from legal documents but remained in practice. Requests for information about child deaths before 1915 are still redirected to the county office, which has no records and claims no jurisdiction. The silence was not a mistake or a failure of leadership. It was chosen, voted on, typed up, stamped, and stored like any other law. And in a town that once grew too many children and buried too few mothers, silence became its own currency, traded in trust, preserved in ink, enforced by memory, a language where nothing needed to be said because everything had already been decided. In the summer of 1981, 3 boys chasing dragonflies through the wheat fields wandered too far west and came across what they thought was a rusted playground. It wasn't. It was the old windmill, the last structure left standing from what was once the Garvey property. The blades no longer turned. The metal had twisted from storms and time, bent like fingers frozen mid-claw. The ground around it had hardened into a strange mix of clay and ash, never quite growing, never quite dead. No one in town had told the children to avoid it, but no one talked about it either. The windmill was just a shape on the horizon, one that should have fallen long ago but hadn't. That day they played near it until one tripped over something buried just beneath the topsoil. It looked like a root, but it clicked when touched. It was a bone, not animal, not fossil, small, human, clean. They dug a little more and found others. 6 in total, bundled loosely in a cloth pouch that looked like it had once been part of a church flag. Each bone was marked, not with ink or paint, but with carvings. One bore the letter E. Another had a date, 1906. One had been etched with the looped symbol seen before. The same one Lydia May described, the same one found on the old instruments and the enamel in the curtain hems. But what chilled investigators most wasn't the symbols. It was the location. The bones weren't near the barn or the shed or the crumbling outline of the Garvey house. They were inside the circular shadow of the windmill's turning blades, exactly where the afternoon sun would have hit at its highest point. and someone had buried them not randomly but arranged in a rough spiral, toes pointed outward, as if laid down in quiet ceremony. As if meant to be remembered, more bones were found in the weeks that followed, 19 in all from children no older than 2, each with some sort of marking, letters, dates, numbers that didn't align with birthdays or baptisms. Some had a tiny groove drilled into the center. Some had been polished smooth. One still had a tag wrapped around it, water-damaged but legible. For collection only. The town council, decades removed from the days of Sheriff Boone and Clara Garvey, responded with a mix of outrage and confusion. No one living admitted to knowing anything. Yet old families left town quietly in the months after. A few properties were sold without listing. A former mayor suffered a stroke and in the middle of recovery reportedly muttered the same phrase over and over. "It was in the milk. It was in the milk." Eventually, after public pressure, a memorial was built. It stood just 10 feet from the windmill, made of blackened wood and reclaimed metal from the collapsed barn. The plaque read only, "For those not counted." No names, no years, just that phrase. The unveiling drew a modest crowd, mostly strangers, reporters, and former residents too young to understand what it meant. The local paper ran a short piece on the history of the land, calling it a tragedy of poor record-keeping and outdated medical care. But behind the fence, where the real stories lived, no one forgot what had been unearthed. And late at night, when the wind caught just right, the rusted blades of the windmill creaked once, only once, as if stirred not by air but memory. The sheriff's department closed the case, citing historical ambiguity. No charges, no further excavation. The land was officially marked as reclaimed pasture, but nothing grew there. Soil tests came back inconclusive. The ground refused to hold seed. Locals swore animals turned away before crossing the fence line. And children, even those born long after, would sometimes stop at the edge and say they heard humming. A low, rhythmic hum like breath or machinery or both. The bones were never claimed. They were placed in an unmarked ossuary in the town's northern woods. Even the path leading to it was left untended. The cemetery keeper said it was better that way. He called it a place for things we don't write down. Decades later, a researcher from out of state visited to collect information on rural child mortality rates and asked about the Garvey site. The town clerk offered her a pamphlet about the memorial but warned there were no public records. The researcher asked why the plaque said, "Not counted." The clerk, older now, just shrugged and said, "Because they weren't." And in a town built on survival, built on rituals too old to admit, that answer was all there ever was.